In the tightly knit, tradition-bound town of Jericho, Pastor Malik Johnson is a man of secrets. Revered by his congregation and feared by his enemies, Malik has spent years burying his true self, bound by duty, family honor, and faith. But when his forbidden love for his cousin Andre resurfaces, Malik finds himself caught in a desperate struggle to keep his hidden life from unraveling and from the ruthless Sheriff Buckley Wright, a powerful white man with a personal vendetta and a dark obsession with Malik's family. As threats mount and Malik's fragile double life teeters on the brink, he becomes trapped between protecting his family's legacy and staying true to his heart. Sheriff Wright, driven by racism and his own twisted motivations, exploits Malik's secret, dragging the Johnson family into a web of blackmail, violence, and betrayal. When Malik's wife, Shonda, uncovers the truth, she too becomes entangled in a sinister game where trust is shattered, loyalties are tested, and survival is anything but guaranteed. As the clock ticks down, Malik must face an unthinkable choice: betray his family and faith or sacrifice everything, including the people he loves, to finally escape the chains of his own secrets. But in Jericho, sins never stay buried, and blood will have blood. Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you find it compelling, don't forget to hit subscribe. Pastor Malik Johnson stood before his congregation, his voice steady as he delivered his sermon. The afternoon sun filtered through the stained glass windows of Jericho Baptist Church, casting colorful patterns across the worn pews and the bowed heads of the congregation. He spoke of redemption, the burden of sin, and the grace that awaited those who truly repented. His words were measured, his tone confident, the kind of confidence that had earned him respect in this tightly knit community. His presence commanded attention, his dark suit perfectly pressed, his eyes steady as they met the faces of the people who looked up to him. But the illusion of control shattered when Sheriff Buckley Wright entered the church, his heavy boots echoing on the polished wooden floor. Malik faltered, just for a moment, his voice catching on a word before he pushed forward, masking his unease. Wright took a seat near the back, his eyes never leaving Malik, a predatory smile playing on his lips. The sheriff's presence was a deliberate intrusion, his posture relaxed but his gaze unyielding, a silent challenge. Malik's heart pounded beneath his composed exterior, his palms growing damp beneath the weight of his Bible. Sheriff Wright had always been a threat, a looming figure who wore his power like a weapon. And today, with his cold blue eyes fixed on Malik, the unspoken accusations hung heavy in the air. The sheriff tilted his head slightly, as if daring Malik to slip, to stumble. Malik cleared his throat, his gaze drifting to his wife, Shonda, who sat in the front pew, her eyes filled with warmth and pride. He drew strength from her, his voice growing firmer as he continued, forcing himself to focus on the message he had prepared. "We must have faith," Malik said, his voice louder, resonating through the sanctuary. "Faith in each other, in our families, and most importantly, in the Lord above." He tried to ignore Wright's stare, to block out the sheriff's mocking smirk. "For it is through faith that we overcome temptation, that we find the strength to rise above our sins." The congregation responded with murmurs of agreement, a few scattered amens punctuating Malik's words. But he couldn't shake the feeling of dread curling in his stomach. He knew the sheriff wasn't here for spiritual guidance. Wright had come for him. When the sermon ended, Malik stepped down from the pulpit, shaking hands and offering kind words to his parishioners as they filed out. Wright remained seated, his eyes never leaving Malik, waiting until the last of the congregation had left the church. Malik took a deep breath, his fingers tightening around his Bible as he approached the sheriff, his smile strained. "Sheriff Wright," Malik greeted, keeping his voice level, "is there something I can help you with?" Wright stood, towering over Malik, his smile widening. "Why, Pastor, I just came to hear the good word," he drawled, his voice thick with false sincerity. "But I think you and I both know there's more to discuss." He stepped closer, his smile fading, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Your sins, Malik. They're going to catch up to you, sooner or later." Malik's mouth went dry, his pulse pounding in his ears. He forced himself to stand tall, to not show fear, but the sheriff's words hit their mark, a direct blow to the carefully constructed facade he had built. "I don't know what you're talking about," he managed, his voice tight. Wright chuckled, a low, menacing sound. "Oh, I think you do, Pastor. I think you know exactly what I'm talking about." He leaned in, his breath hot against Malik's ear. "And I'll be watching, waiting. It's only a matter of time." With that, Wright turned and strode out of the church, leaving Malik standing there, his heart hammering, his hands trembling. The sanctuary, once a place of peace and solace, now felt cold, the air thick with the threat of what was to come. Malik closed his eyes, trying to steady his breathing, but the sheriff's words echoed in his mind, a dark promise that his sins would not stay buried forever. The sunlight outside was harsh and unyielding as Malik stepped out of the church, his hands still trembling from the encounter with Sheriff Wright. The parking lot was almost empty, but Malik's gaze fell on Wright, who leaned casually against his patrol car, arms crossed and a predatory smirk etched across his face. Malik felt the unease from earlier return with full force, his stomach tightening as he approached the sheriff, each step feeling heavier than the last. Wright straightened as Malik drew near, his pale blue eyes narrowing in satisfaction. "Nice sermon, Pastor," he sneered, the edge in his tone unmistakable. "Always good to remind folks about sin. Especially yours." Malik clenched his jaw, a flicker of anger breaking through his fear. He knew better than to respond, but something in Wright's expression made him feel cornered, helpless. "What do you want, Sheriff?" he asked quietly, his voice barely steady. Wright's smile faded, replaced by a look of dark satisfaction. "It's simple. I know about your little secret, Pastor. About your cousin Andre." His words were a low growl, laced with venom. Malik's heart skipped a beat, his breath catching. He'd gone to such lengths to hide it, burying his feelings deep beneath layers of duty and faith. But here, with Wright standing over him, it felt as if every sacrifice, every ounce of restraint, had been for nothing. "Listen, I don't know what you think you know," but Malik started, struggling to maintain his composure. "Save it," Wright interrupted, his voice dripping with disdain. "You can keep playing the holy man for Jericho, but you and I both know what you are. A liar. A hypocrite." Wright's eyes gleamed, his words cruel and calculated. "And I could end it all for you. Just one little whisper to the right people, and you'll be out on your holy behind." Malik's throat tightened, and he felt a wave of shame and anger wash over him. The sheriff wasn't just threatening him, he was mocking everything Malik had worked to build: the respect, the faith, the family. "What do you want?" Wright Malik forced out, the tension in his voice palpable. Wright's smile returned, a slow, deliberate curve of his lips. "You'll do exactly as I say. I'll tell you when, and you'll comply without question." Otherwise he let the threat hang, his eyes cold and unfeeling. "I'll make sure your precious congregation learns all about the real Pastor Malik Johnson." Wright stepped closer, his face inches from Malik's. "I know your type. Pretending to be righteous, but really you're just like everyone else. Weak, and now I own you." As Wright stepped back and walked away, Malik stood rooted to the spot, his mind reeling. The facade he had crafted so carefully felt fragile, on the verge of crumbling under the weight of Wright's threat. He watched the sheriff's figure disappear around the corner, a bitter taste filling his mouth. Taking a shaky breath, Malik looked up at the sky, his vision blurring. He was trapped, forced to choose between his own truth and the lie he'd been living for years. And he knew, deep down, that there was no easy way out. Malik's footsteps echoed through the quiet halls of his home as he entered, the air thick with the lingering scent of Shonda's cooking. The house was warm and inviting, but Malik felt a chill crawl up his spine, remnants of his earlier encounter with Sheriff Wright still gripping him. He had hoped the familiar walls of his home might calm him, but the opposite was true. Shonda appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel, her face lighting up as she caught sight of him. "Hey honey, how was the service?" Malik forced a smile, but his face betrayed the strain he was under. "It was." "Fine," he replied, his voice softer than usual. He stepped forward to embrace her, letting her warmth ground him, if only for a moment. But Shonda pulled back, her brow furrowing as she looked him over. "You seem tense, Malik. Is everything all right?" Malik hesitated, the weight of Wright's threats pressing down on him. He searched Shonda's eyes, but he knew he couldn't burden her with the truth. "Not yet. Just a lot on my mind," he murmured, squeezing her hand. Shonda didn't look convinced, but she nodded, allowing the silence to settle between them. "All right. Dinner's ready if you're hungry," she said, her voice gentle but tinged with worry. Malik nodded, grateful for the small reprieve. "I'll be right there." As he made his way to the dining room, he caught sight of their two children, Sarah and Elijah, laughing together over a game on the living room floor. The sight should have comforted him, but it only added to the ache in his chest. His family was his world, and the thought of Wright's threats tearing it apart was unbearable. Dinner was quiet, the usual lively conversation replaced by an uneasy silence. Shonda's eyes lingered on him, questions left unasked, while the children seemed oblivious, chattering happily about their day. Malik tried to keep up, nodding and smiling at their stories, but his mind kept drifting back to Wright's words. Finally, as the plates were cleared, Shonda touched his arm. "Malik," she began softly, her eyes full of concern. "Whatever it is, you know you can talk to me, right?" The sincerity in her voice nearly broke him. He opened his mouth, 1,000 words crowding his mind, but nothing came out. How could he explain the impossible choices he faced, the double life he'd kept hidden for so long? "Of course, Shonda," he said, reaching for her hand. "I just need some time to sort things out, that's all." Shonda looked at him for a long moment, her gaze searching, before she finally nodded. But Malik could see the doubt lingering in her eyes, the seeds of suspicion already planted. And as he sat in the quiet of his home, surrounded by the people he loved, he couldn't shake the sense that everything was slipping away, one secret at a time. The night air was thick and heavy as Malik slipped out of the house, his steps cautious as he moved toward the secluded spot he and Andre had used for years. The old, abandoned shed on the edge of town had become their secret haven, a place where Malik could drop the mask he wore in Jericho, if only for a few stolen moments. Tonight, though, the thrill of seeing Andre was clouded by the sheriff's threats that loomed over him like a storm. When he reached the shed, Andre was already there, leaning against the wall, his face a mix of relief and worry as he caught sight of Malik. They locked eyes, a shared understanding passing between them. Andre opened his arms, and Malik moved toward him, the tension easing from his shoulders as they embraced, their silent comfort lingering. "I was worried you wouldn't come," Andre whispered, his hand lingering at the back of Malik's neck. Malik closed his eyes, breathing in the scent of him, the familiar warmth. "I didn't know if I should," Malik admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "The sheriff. He knows about us." Andre stiffened, pulling back slightly to look Malik in the eye. "What do you mean he knows? How?" "I don't know," Malik replied, frustration and fear mixing in his voice, "but he made it clear. He threatened to expose me, to destroy everything." Andre's face twisted with anger. "That man has no right. He's been harassing your family for years now. He's just using his badge to do it." He took Malik's hands, his grip firm. "Let's leave, Malik, you and me. We can start over somewhere new where no one knows us, where we don't have to hide." The idea was tempting, a life free from the burden of secrecy and fear, where Malik could be himself without constant scrutiny. But the thought of leaving everything behind, his family, his congregation, his wife, felt like a betrayal. Shonda's face flashed in his mind, along with the image of their children, laughing and innocent. He shook his head, the ache in his chest growing. "I can't, Andre. My family. They depend on me. My congregation, too." He looked away, his voice barely a murmur. "And Shonda. She doesn't deserve this." Andre's expression softened, a mixture of sadness and understanding in his eyes. "I know you're trying to do what's right, Malik, but are you willing to sacrifice your own happiness forever, to live in fear?" Malik looked at him, the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. He wanted to believe there was a way out, a path that wouldn't hurt everyone he loved, but it felt impossible. He was trapped between his duty to his family and his love for Andre, a love he'd never allowed himself to fully embrace. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice breaking, "but I can't risk everything I've built, not yet." Andre nodded, though disappointment flickered in his eyes. "I understand, Malik. But remember, you deserve happiness too." They stood there in silence, the night stretching between them, filled with unspoken words and impossible choices. For a moment, Malik let himself believe that, just maybe, there was a way out of this darkness. But as he pulled away from Andre and turned to leave, the sheriff's threats echoed in his mind, a grim reminder of the chains that bound him. The morning light filtered through the kitchen window as Malik sat across from his grandmother, Pearl, her sharp gaze fixed on him. He'd always found comfort in her presence, a steady force in his life that had guided him since he was a child. But today there was a tension in the air, an unspoken concern reflected in her eyes. She studied him quietly as he sipped his coffee, trying to gather his thoughts and push away the memories of his night with Andre. Finally, Pearl cleared her throat, her voice as steady as ever. "Malik, I know something's weighing on you. You've got that look in your eyes, the one your father used to get when he was keeping things from us." Malik shifted in his seat, looking down into his cup to avoid her gaze. He respected Pearl deeply. She was the matriarch, the one who'd raised him to honor his family and uphold the values of the church. If anyone could see through him, it was her. "I'm fine, Grandma," he said, forcing a small smile. "Just things with the church, the congregation, it's nothing I can't handle." Pearl's eyes narrowed, the warmth of her gaze replaced by something sharper, more probing. "I'm not one to pry, Malik, but don't insult me by lying. You've been carrying a burden, and I can see it clear as day." She leaned closer, her voice lowering. "Whatever it is, remember what I've taught you. Our family name means something in this town. It's up to us to uphold it." Malik felt a pang of guilt twist in his chest. Pearl had always instilled a sense of duty in him, a deep-rooted understanding of what it meant to be a Johnson in Jericho. It was a legacy, one he'd promised himself he wouldn't tarnish. But his secrets threatened to unravel everything she'd worked so hard to build. "I know, Grandma," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know how important family is." Pearl nodded, her gaze softening slightly. "Good. I've seen how hard you work, how much you sacrifice for everyone. But Malik," she paused, her voice dropping to a gentle whisper sometimes, "the greatest sin isn't what we do, but what we hide." The words hit Malik like a punch, the truth of them settling heavily on his heart. Pearl knew something, even if she didn't know the details, and her warning was clear. Whatever secrets he was holding, she would not stand for them tainting the family's reputation. She reached across the table, her hand covering his. "You're a good man, Malik, and I'm proud of you. But remember, we have a duty to our family, to our faith, and to this community. Don't let anything, or anyone, lead you astray." Malik swallowed, his throat tight with emotion. He forced himself to meet her gaze, nodding solemnly. "I understand, Grandma." Pearl gave his hand a reassuring squeeze before letting go, her expression softening. "Good. We've lost enough in this family already. I don't want to lose you too." As she rose and moved to the sink, Malik sat in silence, her words echoing in his mind. He knew the path he was on was unsustainable, the weight of his double life growing heavier by the day. Pearl's warning had cut deep, a reminder that his actions didn't just affect him, they had the power to bring down his entire family. And as he watched her move around the kitchen, he realized that his time to make a choice was running out. The sun was dipping low in the sky as Malik locked up the church for the evening, his thoughts heavy with Pearl's words still echoing in his mind. He hadn't noticed Sheriff Wright's car parked nearby until he turned to leave, his heart sinking at the sight. Wright leaned against the hood, arms folded, watching Malik with a cold, triumphant smile. "Evening," Pastor Wright called, his voice carrying an edge of mockery. Malik felt a surge of anger but forced himself to stay calm, knowing that anything he said could only make things worse. "Sheriff," Malik greeted, his tone clipped as he tried to walk past. But Wright stepped forward, blocking his path. "Not so fast," he drawled. "I told you we'd be having a little arrangement, didn't I?" Malik clenched his jaw, unwilling to give the sheriff the satisfaction of a response. He kept his eyes forward, his hands tightening around his Bible. But Wright wasn't about to let him off that easily. "You're going to listen to me," Wright continued, his tone dropping to a menacing whisper. "Starting tonight, you'll be making some financial contributions to my projects. A few hundred every month should do for starters, and I expect favors when I need them, small tasks to start." Malik's stomach twisted. "I don't have that kind of money, Sheriff, and I won't be involved in whatever illegal things you're up to." Wright's smile vanished, replaced by a look of icy anger. Without warning, he grabbed Malik by the collar, shoving him roughly against the church wall. Malik winced as his back hit the brick, the sheriff's grip tight and unyielding. "Don't you dare talk back to me," Wright hissed, his face inches from Malik's. "You're nothing, Johnson. Just a hypocrite hiding behind that collar. And don't think for a second that I won't tear down every part of your life. All it takes is one word from me, and everyone in Jericho will know what kind of man you really are." Malik's pulse pounded in his ears, a mix of fear and fury rising within him. He wanted to fight back, to shove Wright off and tell him to leave him and his family alone, but the sheriff's hold was iron strong and the threat in his eyes was chillingly real. Wright released him suddenly, and Malik staggered, barely keeping his balance. "Think of this as a warning," Wright said, brushing his hands as if he'd touched something dirty. "Next time, I won't be so gentle." Malik steadied himself, his hands shaking as he glared at the sheriff. "Why are you doing this?" he demanded, his voice barely above a whisper. Wright smirked. "Because I can. And because men like you. You think you're better than everyone else. It's time someone reminded you that you're just as flawed, just as sinful." With that, he turned and walked back to his car, leaving Malik alone in the darkening churchyard. Malik watched him drive away, his heart pounding, his chest tight with humiliation and rage. He'd never felt so powerless, so trapped. And as he stood there, the full weight of his predicament settled on him. If he didn't comply, everything he cared about, his family, his faith, his life, would be torn apart. The house was quiet when Shonda stumbled upon the letter tucked beneath a stack of bills on Malik's desk. She hadn't been looking for it, she was only sorting through the day's mail, but the moment her eyes landed on the familiar handwriting, a strange feeling settled over her. Curiosity turned to dread as she unfolded the letter, her eyes skimming over Andre's words, phrases that spoke of longing, of secrecy, of love. Her hand trembled as she read, the reality of it sinking in with every line. The tone was intimate, the words charged with an affection that felt too close, too personal, and as she reached the end, a single thought formed in her mind, a realization so painful she felt her breath catch. Her husband, her Malik, had been hiding something from her, something so deep and consuming it felt like a betrayal. The room spun as she sank into the chair, clutching the letter in her hands. She tried to convince herself it was a misunderstanding, that there was another explanation, but deep down she knew. She had seen the tension in Malik's face, his distance, his late nights and vague answers. It had all added up, leading to this moment of devastating clarity. She sat there, frozen, until she heard the front door open. Malik's footsteps were unmistakable as he entered the house, his voice calling her name as he made his way through the hall. "Shonda, you here?" She looked up, her mind racing, her heart pounding with anger, hurt, and confusion. Clutching the letter in her hand, she stood, feeling a cold resolve settle over her. She would not let him see her broken. Malik stepped into the room, his smile fading the moment he saw her expression. His gaze fell to the letter in her hands, and a look of horror crossed his face. "Shonda, I can explain," he started, his voice barely above a whisper. She held up a hand, cutting him off. "Explain." Her voice was calm, too calm, laced with the pain that was barely contained beneath the surface. "Explain what, Malik? Explain why I'm reading a letter from your cousin that sounds more like it was written by a lover." Malik's shoulders sagged, his face drawn with guilt. He tried to reach for her, but she took a step back, holding up the letter as if it were a shield. Don't you dare touch me right now." "Shonda, please," he said, his voice breaking. "It's not what you think. I never wanted to hurt you. It's complicated." She let out a bitter laugh, the sound harsh and raw. "Complicated? You call this complicated?" She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I trusted you, Malik. I thought I knew you. But this is a betrayal, not just to me, but to our family, to everything we've built together." Malik's eyes filled with regret, his hands reaching out imploringly. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I've tried so hard to be the man you and the kids deserve, but there are parts of me I couldn't bury, no matter how much I tried." Shonda looked away, unable to bear the sight of him. "How long?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "How long have you been hiding this?" He hesitated, shame coloring his features. "For as long as I can remember." Her heart broke a little more with his admission, the weight of his words crushing her. She had shared her life with him, built a family, believed in his faith and his leadership, only to discover a side of him she never knew existed. "I need you to leave," she said, her voice trembling with finality. "Shonda, please." "I said leave." Her tone was cold, unyielding, leaving no room for argument. Malik stood there, his face a mask of sorrow, before he turned and walked out of the room. She listened to his footsteps fade, her heart shattering with each step. And as she clutched the letter, alone in the silence, the realization hit her with brutal force: their life would never be the same again. Malik sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel as he waited at the edge of town for Andre. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale glow over the empty road ahead. His mind raced, every part of him filled with the tension of the past few days. Shonda's hurt, Wright's threats, his grandmother's warnings, all of it weighed on him, pressing down until he could hardly breathe. Finally, a car pulled up behind him, and Andre stepped out, his face shadowed but his eyes reflecting Malik's own desperation. Malik opened his car door, stepping out to meet him. For a moment they stood in silence, neither sure where to begin. "Are you okay?" Andre asked softly, his gaze sweeping over Malik's face. Malik nodded, though he knew he wasn't. "I don't know how much longer I can live like this," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I feel like I'm being torn apart." Andre took a deep breath, his expression resolute. "Then let's leave, Malik. We don't have to stay here. We don't owe this town anything." Malik looked away, torn between the relief that leaving Jericho offered and the crushing guilt that came with abandoning his family. "It's not that simple, Andre. I have responsibilities, a family, a congregation. They depend on me." Andre reached out, placing a hand on Malik's shoulder. "But you're losing yourself, Malik. How long are you going to sacrifice everything, even your own happiness, for people who don't know who you really are?" Malik looked down, his fists clenched. The prospect of freedom, of living without fear, without hiding, was tantalizing. He had dreamed of it so many times, of a life where he could be honest, where he could be with Andre without feeling ashamed or afraid. But it was a dream tainted by the reality of what he would leave behind. "What about Shonda? And the kids?" he asked, his voice cracking. "They didn't ask for this, and they don't deserve to suffer because of my choices." Andre's face softened. "I know. And I'd never ask you to turn your back on them, Malik. But you deserve to be happy too. You deserve to live without this fear hanging over you." He paused, his hand squeezing Malik's shoulder gently. "What if we just go somewhere, even just for a little while? A fresh start, just the two of us." The thought stirred something in Malik, a flicker of hope in the darkness that had surrounded him for so long. A chance to be himself, even if just for a short time. But as he looked into Andre's eyes, he felt the weight of his obligations settle back over him, suffocating that hope. "If I leave, what kind of man does that make me?" Malik whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "What kind of father?" Andre sighed, pulling Malik into a tight embrace. "It doesn't make you a bad man, Malik. You're doing what you can to survive. But whatever you decide, just know I'm here. I'll always be here." They stood there in the silence of the night, Malik caught between the life he'd built and the life he wanted. He wanted so badly to leave, to escape the expectations, the lies, the judgment. But as much as he yearned for freedom, he couldn't shake the guilt that bound him to Jericho. After a long silence, Malik finally pulled away, his face filled with the painful resolve he felt deep in his heart. "I can't leave yet, Andre. Not like this. Not while everything is falling apart." Andre nodded, though Malik could see the sadness in his eyes. "I understand. But whenever you're ready, just know I'm here." Malik managed a faint smile, nodding as he watched Andre return to his car. He stayed there long after Andre drove away, the weight of his decision pressing down on him like a stone. He knew his path was set, for now, but the pull to leave remained, a whisper in his heart that he couldn't ignore. Malik found himself sitting in his grandmother Pearl's living room, the air thick with the scent of lavender and old wood. Pearl had called him over that evening, her voice calm but insistent. He hadn't wanted to come, still shaken by the events of the last few days, but something in her tone told him this was important. She watched him from her armchair, her face lined with age but her eyes sharp and clear. Malik shifted uncomfortably under her gaze, feeling the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. "Malik," she began, her voice gentle but steady, "there's something you need to know. Something I should have told you a long time ago." Malik frowned, confused by her serious tone. "What is it, Grandma?" Pearl took a deep breath, her hands folding in her lap as she looked away, gathering her thoughts. "This family, we've been holding secrets for generations, secrets that can tear us apart if we're not careful." Malik felt a chill as he listened, sensing the gravity of her words. "What do you mean?" She looked him in the eye, her expression filled with a sadness he hadn't seen before. "Years ago, when I was young, I fell in love with a man I wasn't supposed to. A white man from one of the powerful families in town." She paused, her voice catching. "His name was Charles Wright." The name hit Malik like a blow, his mind reeling as he pieced together the implications. Wright, as in Sheriff Buckley Wright. Pearl nodded, her face etched with sorrow. Yes, Charles was Buckley's uncle. We were young and foolish, but we loved each other. It wasn't meant to be, and eventually we went our separate ways. But I never forgot him, and I don't think he ever forgot me. Malik's mind raced, a mixture of disbelief and anger rising within him. So, Buckley, he's connected to us. Yes, Pearl replied, her voice tinged with regret. He doesn't know, but it's true. I never wanted you or anyone else to bear the burden of my choices, but I see now that maybe it was wrong to keep it hidden. Malik's hands clenched in his lap, the weight of this revelation crashing over him. The sheriff's hatred for him, the vendetta he'd held against their family, it wasn't just about race or power. It was something darker, rooted in a history neither of them could change. So, he might be. Malik struggled to say the words. Pearl nodded, her gaze filled with pain. Yes, he could be your half-uncle. Malik sat back, his mind spinning as he tried to absorb this truth. All his life he'd been taught to view the Wrights as enemies, a family that looked down on theirs, that kept them underfoot. And now, to learn that the blood of a Wright ran in his own veins. It was almost too much to bear. Why are you telling me this now? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Because I can see the path you're on, Malik, Pearl replied, her tone soft but firm. I see the pain you carry, the choices you're being forced to make. I want you to understand that sometimes, the bonds we have, whether by blood or by choice, are more complicated than we realize. And that doesn't mean you have to follow in my footsteps. Malik felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of anger, betrayal, and a strange sense of relief. He wasn't sure what to do with this knowledge or how it might change his choices going forward. But one thing was clear: the connection between him and Buckley Wright went deeper than he'd ever imagined. As he sat in silence, Pearl reached out, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. I know this is a lot to take in, but remember, Malik, you're stronger than any secret, and no matter what you decide to do, I'll be here. Malik met her gaze, a flicker of determination settling over him. He didn't know where this revelation would lead, but he knew one thing: he would not let Buckley Wright control him any longer. Shonda sat alone in her car, gripping the steering wheel as she stared at the sheriff's office. She'd come here as a last resort, a desperate attempt to protect her family. Her mind raced, torn between anger and fear, but a fierce determination pushed her forward. If there was any way to shield her children from the fallout of Malik's secrets, she had to try. Taking a steadying breath, she climbed out of the car and walked up the steps, her heels clicking against the concrete with every step. The sheriff's secretary looked up, surprise flickering across her face, but Shonda held her head high, refusing to show a hint of hesitation. I need to speak with Sheriff Wright, she said, her voice firm. The secretary looked doubtful but nodded, gesturing for her to wait. Moments later, Wright appeared, his smirk already in place as if he'd expected her. Mrs. Johnson, he drawled, his voice thick with feigned politeness. What can I do for you? Shonda steeled herself, meeting his gaze without flinching. We need to talk, Sheriff. Privately. Wright raised an eyebrow, but he led her into his office, closing the door behind them. He leaned back against his desk, crossing his arms as he regarded her with a smug expression. To what do I owe the pleasure? She swallowed hard, choosing her words carefully. I know about Malik and Andre. I know about the threats you've made against him, and I know you're using it to control him. Wright's smile widened, a flash of triumph in his eyes. Well, I didn't expect the dutiful wife to come here on her husband's behalf. But go on. Shonda took a deep breath, keeping her composure. I came to ask you to leave him alone, to stop threatening him and our family. Wright laughed, the sound cold and mocking. And what makes you think I'd do that? Your husband has given me all the leverage I need. Why would I give that up? Because I'm willing to make a deal, Shonda replied, her voice steady. I'll distance myself from Malik, publicly. I'll let everyone know that I don't condone his choices. I'll protect the Johnson name and the church's reputation. In exchange, you leave my family alone, especially the children. Wright's eyes narrowed as he studied her, the amusement fading from his expression. You're willing to ruin your own marriage to protect him? How noble. It's not about him, Shonda said sharply, her tone betraying the anger she'd kept in check. It's about my children. They don't deserve to suffer because of this, and I'll do whatever it takes to keep them safe." Wright looked thoughtful, as if weighing her offer. He leaned forward, his gaze predatory. "Fine. You keep up appearances, distance yourself from Malik, and make it clear to everyone where you stand. If you do that, I'll ease up on him. For now." Shonda nodded, relief and dread settling over her. She had secured her children's safety, but the price felt higher than she could bear. She had built her life on loyalty, on commitment to her family, but now she would have to stand apart, to become a stranger to her own husband in the eyes of their community. "Remember," Mrs. Johnson Wright added, his voice low and cold, "if you slip up, if you go back on this agreement, I'll come after him again. And next time, I won't be so generous." Shonda met his gaze, her jaw set. "I understand." She left the sheriff's office feeling hollow, each step back to her car heavier than the last. She had fought for her family, for her children, but she couldn't shake the sense that something precious had been lost forever. And as she drove home, the weight of the bargain settled over her, a reminder that some sacrifices could never be undone. The church sanctuary was empty, its dim, flickering lights casting long shadows across the rows of pews. Malik stood near the pulpit, his heart pounding as he waited, his body tense with anticipation. He had called Sheriff Wright here, desperate for a way to end the torment, the lies, and the fear. Tonight he would confront the man who had taken everything from him. The heavy door creaked open, and Wright's silhouette appeared, framed by the faint glow of the hallway light. He strolled into the sanctuary with an air of confidence, a sneer tugging at his lips as he saw Malik waiting. Pastor Wright greeted mockingly, his voice echoing through the quiet room. "Calling me here alone? Seems like a poor choice on your part." Malik clenched his fists, trying to steady his breathing. "This ends tonight, Wright. I won't let you keep controlling my life. I'm done." Wright chuckled, his expression one of dark amusement. "Done? You think you can just walk away from me? From everything I know about you," he stepped closer, his voice low and taunting. "You don't have the power here, Malik. I do, and I can ruin you with a single word." Malik's jaw tightened, his voice a mixture of anger and desperation. "You've taken everything from me, my family, my congregation, my dignity. I have nothing left to lose, Sheriff." Wright's smile twisted into a scowl, his eyes flashing with anger. "Is that supposed to scare me? You're nothing more than a hypocrite hiding behind a collar. And now everyone will see you for what you really are." Malik's heart hammered as he stepped forward, his voice rising with the strength he'd held back for so long. "And what about you, Buckley? What kind of man are you, hiding behind your badge and using your power to hurt others?" Wright's face darkened, a dangerous glint in his eyes. "You think you're better than me? Don't you? That because you're the so-called good pastor you're above everyone else?" He took another step closer, his tone turning venomous. "You're just like the rest of us, weak, pathetic, and now everyone will know it." Malik could feel the rage building, years of humiliation and fear rising to the surface. "I may have made mistakes," he said, his voice trembling with emotion, "but I have tried to be a good man. I've tried to protect my family. And you've only ever tried to destroy." Wright laughed, a harsh, hollow sound. "Protect? You think dragging them through the mud is protecting them?" He shook his head, sneering. "Face it, Malik, you're nothing but a coward." The words struck deep, and Malik felt his control slipping, the weight of every choice, every sacrifice, crashing down on him. He took a step back, his mind racing, but before he could respond, Wright lunged forward, shoving him back against the pulpit with a force that knocked the breath from his lungs. Malik stumbled, clutching the edge of the pulpit to steady himself, his vision blurring with pain and anger. Wright loomed over him, his face twisted with fury. "You brought this on yourself, Johnson," he growled, his voice filled with contempt. With a surge of adrenaline, Malik pushed back, his own anger finally breaking free. "No more Wright. You don't get to decide who I am or what I stand for." The two men stood there, locked in a silent battle of wills, each daring the other to make the next move. Finally, Wright stepped back, a smug smile returning to his face. "Fine," he sneered. "But remember, I'll always be there, waiting, watching. And one day you'll slip up again. And when you do, I'll be ready." With one last look of disdain, Wright turned and strode out of the sanctuary, leaving Malik alone in the dim light. As the door closed behind him, Malik sank to his knees, his body trembling from the confrontation. He had stood up to Wright, but the battle was far from over. The sheriff's dark promise echoed in his mind, a reminder that his struggle was only beginning. But for the first time in years, Malik felt a glimmer of hope, a sense of freedom that had been buried beneath fear and shame. He had faced his enemy, and though the road ahead remained uncertain, he knew he could no longer live in hiding. The days after the confrontation with Sheriff Wright passed in a blur. Malik felt like a ghost in his own life, moving through routines that felt hollow, his heart heavy with the weight of everything he'd lost. Shonda barely spoke to him, keeping her distance even when they were in the same room, her gaze guarded and her tone clipped when she addressed him. The warmth and trust that had once filled their home had been replaced by silence and tension, like a fragile thread stretched to its breaking point. At church, things weren't much better. The congregation sensed the shift, whispers circulating about the pastor's troubled marriage, the strain etched on his face. Malik could see the questions in their eyes, the doubt that lingered just beneath the surface. His sermons lacked the passion they once held, his words echoing back at him in an empty void. He could no longer hide behind his faith, and the sanctuary that had once been his refuge felt like a prison. Shonda had kept her part of the bargain with Wright, distancing herself publicly, her loyalty to their family's image stronger than her connection to Malik. She was protecting the children, as she'd said she would, but every glance between them carried an unspoken sadness. They both knew things could never return to the way they were. One evening, as the sun began to set, Malik found himself alone in the backyard, watching the sky fade from orange to gray. The weight of everything bore down on him: the love he had denied, the secrets he'd tried to bury, and the cost of living a lie for so long. He had tried to protect everyone he loved, but in the end, his silence had only brought pain and destruction. As he sat there, the door opened and Shonda stepped out, her face unreadable as she approached him. She stopped a few feet away, folding her arms as she looked down at him, her gaze steady and searching. "Malik," she began, her voice quiet but firm, "I don't know what the future holds for us, but for our children's sake, we have to find a way to coexist." He nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "I know. I never wanted to hurt you, Shonda. I only wanted to protect you." She let out a soft, bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Protect me? Protect us? All you did was hide, Malik, and in hiding you left us to deal with the consequences of your choices." Malik's shoulders slumped, the truth of her words sinking in. "I was a coward. I see that now. I thought I could hold everything together, but I was only fooling myself." They stood in silence, the weight of the past pressing down on both of them. Finally, Shonda sighed, a flicker of sorrow in her eyes. "I'll stay for the children. But that's all I can promise." Malik nodded, his heart breaking all over again. "Thank you," he murmured, though he knew it was a fragile peace, a truce built on necessity rather than forgiveness. As she turned to leave, Malik looked up at the sky, the stars beginning to appear in the fading light. He felt a strange sense of peace, even amid the wreckage of his life. The chains of his secrets had been broken, and though he had lost nearly everything, he was finally free to face himself. In the months that followed, Malik learned to live with the consequences of his choices. He rebuilt his relationship with his children, making sure they knew his love was unconditional, even if he and Shonda remained distant. He continued his work at the church, his sermons taking on a new tone of honesty, stripped of the pretense he had once hidden behind. He knew his journey was far from over, but for the first time he could see a path forward. The legacy of the Johnson family would carry on, shaped by the truth he had tried so long to deny. And though the scars of his past would remain, he would no longer let them define him.